I'm imagining that somewhere in our midst, either here in the congregation, in the choir loft, or maybe even online with us, I'm pretty sure we have a few football fans. Is that right? I think so. And I'll just say that I'm going to kind of call an audible here at the line of scrimmage this morning. And for those of you who know what that means, when the quarterback comes up to just before accepting the snap, they might look out and see what's going on in front of them, and they may call a different play at the line of scrimmage than they had called in the huddle previously, right? That's calling an audible, right? So I'm calling a little bit of an audible, not so much in line with what I had originally intended, but again, really feeling the impact of several things. Some of you are aware that last Sunday after church, on my way to another church-based meeting, I was in a car accident. It was my fault, unfortunately. I rear-ended someone else. I can say in my defense that it seems like it was pretty unavoidable because someone else turned out in front of the car in front of me, cutting them off. They had to stop suddenly, and there was no place for me to go other than into the car in front of me. Their car seemed to sustain very, very little damage, some scratches in the bumper. However, my insurance company decided that my 11-year-old car was a total loss. It's kind of funny, to get that message. I don't know about you, but to get that message that says, well, we have determined that this accident has resulted in a total loss. What does that mean, a total loss? But then in comparison, say, to what's been going on in the southeastern United States, say in Florida, my total loss is nothing, right? I mean, it's a small inconvenience, and yet it's nothing like the total loss that others are experiencing, have been experiencing, and where our focus may be primarily right now on Florida and the southeastern coast. I shared just last week some of the amazing destruction that has happened recently in Alaska, storms that they had never in history, or at least in living memory, experienced before, wiping out entire communities. And for those of you who are paying attention to world events, we know that there are other parts of the country as well, all around the world, including at the opposite parts of the globe from us in Australia and Pakistan and other places around the world, Bangladesh, where they're having historic floods that have never before been seen. I heard one scientist in Pakistan talking about how their country goes from the heights of the Himalayas to the ocean, and how the melting of the glaciers is impacting the whole population of Pakistan downstream from those glaciers. So we know indeed that climate change is in our midst. Perhaps we might not all agree on all of the various ingredients, whether it's merely cyclical or whether in fact, as the theory goes, that when a butterfly beats its wings in Indiana, that it affects the monsoon rains in the Sea of China. But I think most of us probably would agree that we are part of an interactive, interconnected web of life in which all of life everywhere affects all of life everywhere, not only in this current moment, but also in the past and in the future as well. Well, I guess again, by way of a bit of an explanation, probably you wouldn't be too surprised if I told you that I'm a bit of a research nerd. And so when it comes to replacing a car that's been totaled, I tend to get very obsessed by all the research that's out there, the consumer reports and the safety records and Edmunds Cars reviews and insurance loss data and EPA mileage ratings, and it goes on and on and on, right? It's very, very easy for me, at least, to get lost in that whole universe of data. And then at the end of the day, you come to find out, well, none of those cars are available anyway. So like, what was the point, right? Or if they are available, they're available somewhere 500 miles away. in which case they're 10 or 20 or 30% above manufacturer's retail, suggested retail price. So it's like throwing up your hands and say, like, now what, right? And that may be the case as well for us in terms of this climate change. It can be very easy to be overwhelmed. In fact, there's some pretty good data available that especially younger people are experiencing kind of some generational depression about the state of our environment and whether or not the people who have been in charge or who are currently in charge are taking it seriously enough to really make a big difference. Many of you know as well that I've been spending a lot of time with our granddaughter recently. She'll turn 1 year old in a couple of days. I've spent a lot of time with her over the last month. In fact, she spent 3 days, her first 3 days ever, in childcare 2 weeks ago, and came home on the third day with the cold and hasn't been back since a week and a half ago. Now, that's kind of the way I think childcare goes with young children, right? But still, as I think about the world that my granddaughter will live in, I have to be all the more concerned about things like climate change. What is this world that she will be growing up in? And for me, at least, a sense of consciousness, if not conscience, about what are the decisions that I'm making today that may affect the world and her life for generations to come, right? So of course I'm focusing all of my attention on cars with really good mileage and looking at hybrids and plug-in hybrids and all electric vehicles. And again, it's just amazing. And if I had my way, you know what? I wouldn't drive a car at all. I would just rather walk and ride my bike everywhere. But I think driving is something of a necessary evil in our lives. I think I can say that. Times have been changing. I know I had a pastoral colleague who lived very close by, who was a generation before me, who served some of the churches that I served, and in his older years was a wonderful mentor and friend. And yet I was always kind of interested that he still had the tradition of the Sunday drive, which, as he said, was just like picking a bunch. These are his words, not my words, okay? Don't get mad at me. His words, he would pick up some old friends and go off on a Sunday drive, as he would say, to blow the stink off. That was his words. But I think for most of us, at least, gone are those days when we simply want to go out for a drive just to go out for a drive, because it doesn't really make sense, does it, with gas prices what they are and just traffic what it is. Yeah, I don't enjoy spending time in traffic at all. I don't know about you guys. That's certainly the case for me. But anyway, and thinking about what I might share with you this morning, I happened upon this document that I think is very helpful, very relevant. It's from the Lutheran bishops of Sweden, sharing their views with people of faith about the climate and climate change and Christian responsibility in the midst of climate change. So I want to share with you some of the thoughts from this letter of the Swedish bishops. They begin with the Psalms. The world and all that is in it belong to the Lord. The earth and all who live on it are God's. The psalmist has an idea of the immensity of the world and the universe, and it's quite clear that God's creative force makes every human claim to ownership relative. When the earth belongs to the Lord, all human claims at ownership are merely provisional. The book of Psalms contrasts the smallness of human beings with the immensity of creation and yet our unique role in it. From Psalms 8, when I look at the sky, what are mere human beings that you, O God, think of them, mere mortals that you care for them? Why should God care about the little speck of dust in the universe that we each as human beings represent? And yet the psalmist continues, God made us be inferior only to God's own self and crowned us with glory and honor. God has appointed us as rulers over everything that has been made and placed us over all creation, all animals, sheep and cattle, wild animals, birds and fish and creatures of the sea. While climate issues lay bare our human responsibility and our human power, to cause both good and evil, and our smallness in the face of this risk of radically changing the planet on which we live. The fact that the world is God's creation is self-evident, and we are called to live in response to that. Creation is characterized by mutual dependence between everything that has been created and by our mutual dependence upon God, who constantly maintains God's creative force through the power of the Holy Spirit. On the basis of the creation stories, the role of human beings can be described as one of stewardship. And I know this is a phrase that I often repeat as pastor, that we are stewards of all that has been entrusted to our care as individual human beings, as members of humankind, but also as members and leaders of a community of faith. When we think of all that has been entrusted to our care, the lives of people, the history, the land, the resources, the buildings. Stewards generally have a long-term responsibility. They have far-reaching powers, but must never forget that they hold in trust the property entrusted to them. There comes a day when all stewards are held accountable for the results of their stewardship. The heart of the Christian faith is that God chose to become human in Jesus Christ, and the Bible describes Jesus as our brother and example, as our Redeemer over death, and the visible likeness of the invisible God. In fact, as we prepare to celebrate communion today, communion and baptism are the two sacraments recognized in the Methodist and most Protestant traditions as two that Jesus himself instituted, but also we say that these sacraments, baptism and communion, are outward and visible signs of an inward and invisible grace. In other words, God is working through us to bring God's grace to incarnation, the word in which the world is created. For some 50 years or more, so for some of us within our lifetimes, we have known that human inventiveness has given us the ability to destroy creation and our world with things such as nuclear weapons, but also with all the things that we do to and with in exploitation and utilization of the earth's resources. We do not yet know, this is the bishop speaking, we do not yet know whether human inventiveness and decisiveness will give us the ability to look after creation by halting climate change. However, the view of ourselves as created co-creators with God is definitely an incentive to mobilize the best resources within us and around us so that we can indeed make all the difference that we can in this beautiful world. Our Christian mission is the overflow of the infinite love of the triune God, creator, redeemer, and sustainer. God's mission begins with the act of creation, and creation's life and God's divine will are intertwined. The mission of God's Spirit encompasses us all in an ever-giving act of grace. We are therefore called to move beyond any narrowly human-centered approach and to embrace a mission which expresses our whole creation with all of life. In fact, in the book of John, as we hear Jesus talking with Nicodemus, and Jesus saying to Nicodemus, God so loved the world, the Greek scholars will tell us that when Jesus says God so loved the world, he's really referring to not just the planet or humankind or even all the beings on the earth, but the entire cosmos, the entire creation. God so loved the entire creation. So our mission must be not only for our own human planetary home, but for all creation. We hear the cries of the earth, we see the tears of Mother Earth lamenting in the storms that ravage the land. We hear the cries of the poor who are the most vulnerable and most likely to suffer due to climate change and rising sea levels. So how do we live in such a way to look after creation? Jesus says in Matthew, also in Mark and Luke, if you want to save your own life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. So what might this mean in relationship to the climate crisis? Perhaps a person who derives his or her value from being at the top of a hierarchy always needs to hold tightly and securely to everything they hold as their own as owners. However, if we give up a position of status and power and hierarchy, we have something to gain. And that which we have to gain is life in relationship with all of God's good creation. So the question for us here today, here and now, is what does it look like for us here at St. Paul's these days to be stewards of all of God's good creation, all that's been entrusted to our care? Paul writes in his letter to Timothy, I recall your tears. And those were tears of parting when Paul left Timothy behind on a different mission. We can recall the tears of all those who have gone on before us, who've paved the way for us. And we can call the tears of our own mother planet Earth and those ravaged by destructiveness. How then can we live in loving harmony with God, with creation, with our human family, and with all the cosmos, that we might incarnate God's love in this day and all the days to come? Amen.